Here is what the armed man did not know. The girl on her knees in front of him had, 14 months ago, rappelled from a helicopter into a burning compound in a country she was not officially in, killed 2 armed guards in under 4 seconds, extracted a kidnapped government asset, and walked back to the extraction point with a bullet fragment lodged 2 inches from her spine. Here is what the armed man did know. She was 23. She weighed about 120 pounds. She was crying, or close to it, and she had not yet opened the safe. He pressed the gun to the back of her head and decided she needed another lesson. He was about to teach the last lesson of his life. The fluorescent lights at Ray's Stop Shop hummed at a frequency that Jake Harmon had decided, somewhere around mile 400 of this drive, was specifically designed to accelerate human brain death. It was 11:47 p.m. He'd been on the road since 7 that morning. Reno to Vegas, a straight shot down US 95 through nothing, through more nothing, and then Harlow, Nevada, which was what nothing looked like when it got ambitious enough to incorporate. Population 2,300. 1 stoplight. A diner that closed at 9. And this, a convenience store with a parking lot that held 3 cars and a dying cactus in a pot someone had clearly meant to bring inside and forgotten about 3 summers ago. He pushed through the glass door. A small bell chimed overhead. "Evening," said the cashier without looking up. She was young, early 20s, maybe. Dark hair pulled back in a ponytail that had been neat 8 hours ago and had since surrendered. A polo shirt with the store's logo on the breast, 2 sizes too big. She was scanning inventory on a tablet, one hand moving items on the shelf below the register in a rhythm so automatic it had clearly stopped requiring conscious thought long ago. There were faint circles under her eyes. A faded scar near her left eyebrow, small, old, angled like a bracket. Jake grabbed a coffee from the self-serve station, confirmed it was approximately engine coolant in temperature and substance, and decided he didn't care. He moved through the aisles. Chips, water, gas station sushi that he looked at and immediately put back. At the far end of the store, a middle-aged woman in a manager's vest, name tag, Sarah, was on the phone, half turned away, talking low. A young man in an identical polo, name tag Tommy, was mopping the floor near the bathrooms and losing a battle with his own yawning. A bell above the door chimed again as Jake walked. He glanced toward it reflexively, a habit so deeply wired into him that it operated independently of any conscious instruction. A couple, late 30s, buying lottery tickets and arguing quietly. Nothing. He glanced at the cashier as he passed toward the register. She had moved. Not toward him. Not toward the door. She had drifted, in the 20 seconds Jake had spent in the chip aisle, approximately 4 feet to her left, and she was now sweeping the floor near the entrance, not the register. Idle task. Completely reasonable. Except she was angled, Jake noticed, so that her back was not to the door. He filed this away. Not as anything. Just as a detail that sat slightly wrong in the pile of details that constituted a normal night at a gas station. He carried it the way you carry a stone in your shoe that isn't quite sharp enough to stop you. Just these, he said at the register. Coffee, water, a granola bar that was probably mostly sugar. She came back to the counter with the same unhurried, slightly automatic movement. Rang him up, told him the total. When she handed back his change, her fingers were very still against his palm, not tense, just settled. The way a person's hands settle when their resting state happens to be fine motor control. Long drive, she said. Not particularly curious. The polite script of a cashier at midnight. Getting there, Jake said. She glanced at him once. A single, complete glance that took in his face, his posture, his jacket, the way he stood, and then looked away, as though she had what she needed. Not rude. Not obviously calculating. Just efficient in a way that felt slightly off-script for the 7-Eleven experience. Jake took his bag. He had his hand on the door when the cashier spoke again. Sir. He turned. She was looking at him with an expression that was entirely pleasant and entirely unreadable. There's a 24-hour diner on Route 6 about 8 miles south. Better coffee. A beat. A lot better. He smiled. Thanks. He should have left then. He'd meant to leave then. But he was tired, and the coffee really was terrible, and the night was clear, and 8 miles wasn't much. He went to pour himself a second cup, thinking he'd drink this one here before the drive. He settled against the end of an aisle, read something on his phone, felt his eyelids staging a quiet rebellion. At 11:58, the door opened again. The bell chimed. No one said evening this time. Jake saw the masks first. Not face masks, the full kind, black balaclavas, the kind that meant someone had planned this. The lead man, tall, broad, moving with the posture of someone who had once been trained and had since substituted anger for discipline, came through the door fast and immediately raised a short-barrel shotgun toward the security camera above the register. The explosion was enormous in the small space. Bits of plastic and wiring rained down. The camera was gone. Everyone stay where you are. His voice was the kind that was used to being the loudest voice in any room. He had a way of filling space that went beyond just volume. He positioned himself so that his body subtracted options. Jake had seen exactly this type before. Former enlisted, probably infantry, the kind who'd been told he was made for this and had taken that personally when the military disagreed. Tommy dropped his mop. The handle clattered on the tile like a gunshot itself, and Tommy pressed himself against the bathroom door, hands up, his face gone the color of old chalk. Sarah Mitchell spun from her phone call, saw the gun, and made a sound that was not quite a scream, more like a word her body had swallowed back. Jake did not move. He set his phone face down against his thigh, very slowly, and raised both hands to shoulder height. His eyes began their work, cataloging everything that his training insisted on cataloging whether he wanted it to or not. 3 men total. Lead man, shotgun, confident, commanding. Second man, currently pushing past the lead to clear the back of the store. Compact semi-automatic pistol, moving fast, but checking corners wrong, amateur. Third man at the door, AR pistol, shaking slightly, eyes too wide, somewhere between 20 and 25, first time or close to it. 3 guns. 6 hostages counting himself. No, 7. An older man in overalls had emerged from the bathroom hallway, hands up before he'd even seen what was happening, like someone who'd been waiting for bad news his whole life. The lead man, Jake would later learn his name was Brody Walsh, swept his gaze across the room with the quick, assessing turn of someone deciding what his immediate problem was. He landed on the cashier. She was standing exactly where Jake had last seen her, behind the register, both hands on the counter, eyes down. She had not flinched at the gunshot. Jake registered this without understanding it. You, Brody said, pointing. Come here. Now. The cashier came. She walked around the end of the counter with her hands out from her sides, her steps unhurried but not slow. The specific pace of someone who understood that too fast and too slow were both provocations. She stopped in front of him. He looked her over. Something in his face. Jake had seen this too, in the worst kind of men, decided on her. Selected her. She was young and slight and female, and her shirt was too big for her, and her hair was in a ponytail, and all of this added up, in the specific arithmetic of men like Brody Walsh, to control point. You pick the one they'll instinctively want to protect, and you put a gun on her, and then you own the room. Name, he said. May, she said. Her voice was quiet, but not shaking. May. He said it with the contempt of someone who decided a name was a claim being made that he was choosing not to honor. All right, May. You're going to do exactly what I say. You deviate 1 inch from what I say, and I'm going to make sure everybody here watches what happens to you. Are we clear? Yes, she said. Good girl. Jake felt something cold move through his chest. He looked at the cashier's face. She was looking at the floor, her expression a kind of blank, cooperative fear. She wasn't crying. He filed this away. He added it to the stone in his shoe. Brody didn't waste time. He drove the hostages to the back of the store, herded them into the alcove between the refrigerated section and the back wall, which gave his man at the door clear sight lines and limited any options for movement. The older man in overalls sat on the floor immediately, as though his legs had made this decision unilaterally. Tommy kept his hands so high Jake thought his shoulders might dislocate. Sarah Mitchell was praying, lips moving, words beneath audibility. The couple from the lottery ticket line held each other's hands with a grip that was going to leave marks. Jake sat against the refrigerator case and watched. Brody kept May separate. He positioned her in the open space between the register and the cold drinks, on her knees, his shotgun pointed at the back of her head, while his cousin Danny located the office. This was the performance portion. Jake had seen hostage-takers do this before. Establish a visual hierarchy. Make it viscerally clear who had power and how it would be enforced. It worked because it was nakedly, horrifyingly effective. Put a gun to someone's head and everyone else in the room stops thinking about anything except that gun. Safe, Brody said. Back office. What's the combination? I don't know the combination, the cashier said. Only the manager has it. Which one's the manager? Sarah's hand went up before she decided to raise it. Brody pointed at Danny. Get her. Danny hauled Sarah up. She stumbled, came along. Brody kept the shotgun at May's head. Open it, he told Sarah. Sarah's hands were shaking badly enough that it took 3 attempts. When the safe opened, Brody glanced inside, and something in his face didn't like what it found. Where's the rest? That's everything, Sarah said. Friday's deposit already went. I'm sorry, this is everything there is. Bull. He looked at May. You. The real combination. The one the little manager doesn't know about. The one the owner uses. I don't know what you're talking about, May said. The back of Brody's hand caught her across the cheek with the full weight of the shotgun's grip behind it. The sound was ugly. Sarah screamed. Tommy made a noise that wasn't a word. The man in overalls closed his eyes. The couple pressed against each other. Jake's hands, resting on his knees, curled. He made himself keep them there. The cashier's head had snapped sideways. She was breathing through her nose. Short, controlled exhales. Blood was spreading from a split at her cheekbone, sheeting down her jaw in a thin line. She didn't cry out. She didn't curse him. She turned her head back forward, slowly, and resumed looking at the floor. Jake stared at her. He had been hit across the face. Once with a training baton. Once in a bar fight that had started over something stupid. Once during a SEER course that he'd signed up for voluntarily and immediately regretted. He knew what it looked like when a person absorbed a blow. There was always a moment, animal, involuntary, of pure shocked outrage, the body's protest, the instinctive recoil. She had not had that moment. She'd moved with the strike. Minimally. You'd have to be watching very carefully. But she had rotated her neck a precise few degrees at the moment of impact, distributing force the way a fighter does it, the way a person does it when they've been hit so many times that their body has filed it under familiar. Jake stared at her hands. They were resting flat on her thighs. 2 fingers of her left hand were moving in a slow, rhythmic pattern against her knee. Counting. She was counting. What the hell are you counting? Last chance, Brody said. He grabbed the cashier's ponytail and yanked her head back. Her throat was exposed. Her expression was that blank cooperative mask. There's a secondary register, she said. Her voice was level. Under the service counter, in the left drawer. Owner keeps about $800 in it for large transaction change. He doesn't tell the managers. A pause. You'd have to go to the front of the store to get it. Brody paused. Looked at her. Looked at the front of the store. Marco, he said. The man at the door, Marco, went to the front counter. They heard drawers opening. Yeah, Marco called. Got it. 8:20. Brody released the cashier's hair. She settled back upright. And Jake saw it. The 2 fingers on her knee had stopped counting. She'd timed it. She'd sent Marco away from the door for precisely as long as it would take to verify and return, and she'd used the window to look. In the 4 seconds that Marco's back was turned and Brody was turned toward Marco's voice, the cashier raised her head and swept the room, left to right, quick and complete, and then dropped it again before Brody turned back. She wasn't conducting an inventory. She was running a tactical assessment. Jake felt the stone in his shoe become a knife. Who was this woman? 22 minutes into the hostage situation, Jake Harmon had a list. He'd been constructing it since the blow to the face, because something in his operational mind had refused to let this go, cataloging with the same automatic precision that had watched the door, or counted the weapons, or mapped the exits. Item 1. She had absorbed a pistol whip without the standard trauma response. Item 2. She was measuring time. The finger counting had continued intermittently, always stopping the moment Brody looked at her, always resuming the moment he didn't. She wasn't counting down. She was counting intervals, Brody's attention cycles, learning his rhythm. Item 3. Her breathing. Jake had done enough pre-dive preparation to recognize box breathing on sight. 4 counts in, 4 counts hold, 4 counts out. She was doing a variant of it, slightly compressed, adapted for a situation in which visible calm would itself be a red flag. She was managing her adrenaline load the way a person manages it before a breach. Item 4. The eyes. When Danny moved from the back hallway to the refrigerator alcove, Repositioning behind the cluster of hostages, the cashier's eyes tracked him without her head moving at all. A half-millimeter adjustment of the iris. If you weren't watching for it, you'd miss it entirely. She knew exactly where all three men were at every moment. Item 5, and this was the one that had made Jake's stomach drop, was something he'd tested himself. 15 minutes ago, he had shifted his weight forward, incrementally, toward the refrigerator case beside him, as though merely adjusting for comfort. A trained eye would read it as a potential movement toward the exit corridor. He'd done it as a small experiment. If Marco noticed, Marco's gun angle would shift. If it shifted, the hostages in the left side of the alcove would have a brief window of reduced coverage. The cashier, who could not have seen Jake from her position on the floor without turning her head, had immediately shifted her weight to her left knee, subtly repositioning her body between Marco's adjusted angle and Tommy, who was sitting directly in the new line of fire. She had corrected for a tactical change she'd mathematically anticipated without seeing. Jake leaned back against the refrigerator case and stared at the overhead lights and thought, what in the name of God is happening right now? He thought about calling out to her. He thought about using a code, some vestigial piece of operational language that might mean something to someone with the right background. But there were 3 guns in the room, and Brody Walsh was a man who killed cameras, not conversations, and anything Jake said that sounded wrong could end one or both of them before it helped anything. So he watched. He watched her count Brody's attention cycles. He watched her catalog the room in stolen 3-second intervals. He watched her breathe. And he thought, I have seen exactly one person in my career do something like this. Not in the field, in a classified evaluation video from 14 months ago of a Team 6 candidate assessment. A candidate who had scored higher on certain technical metrics than anyone in the program's history. A candidate whose subsequent assignment he'd been told was classified and whose current status he'd been told was reassigned. He'd seen her face in that video for about 40 seconds. He looked at the cashier's face now. Her hair was different. She was thinner. There was the scar near the eyebrow, new, since the video. And the scar on her jaw was new. And the one just visible at her collarbone. His mouth went dry. Oh, Jake thought. Oh, hell. At 12:29 a.m., Brody's phone rang. He answered it. Jake watched his face change. Not much, just a tightening around the eyes, a flattening of the mouth, and understood before Brody spoke a word. We got company, Brody said to Danny. Danny went to the front window and looked out at an angle. Sheriff's Department. 2 cruisers, no lights. Parked at the far end of the lot. How? Silent alarm, maybe. Register, Danny said. He looked at the cashier with sudden, specific hostility. Wasn't me, she said, without inflection. The alarm trips automatically after 15 minutes if the register goes inactive. I couldn't have stopped it from here. This was probably true. Danny glanced at Brody. Brody decided it was true because the alternative was a problem with no solution. All right, Brody said. He walked the length of the store and back, the loose, agitated pace of a man whose plan has developed an unscheduled variable. All right. All right. He stopped, pointed at Tommy. You, get up. Tommy got up. His knees were shaking. You're going to the door. You're going to tell those cops everything's fine. There's been a mistake. They're not going to believe that, Jake said. Brody turned. He hadn't forgotten Jake. He'd been watching Jake the way you watch the item in a room you're most unsure about. But it was the first time Jake had spoken since the robbery began, and Brody didn't like it. He moved toward Jake with the precise, territorial aggression of someone reclaiming space. He pressed the barrel of the shotgun against Jake's sternum. You got something to say, friend? They won't believe it, Jake said, calmly. They've already called it in. They'll want visual confirmation and a badge number. If your man at the door opens that entrance, they'll see right into the store. He kept his voice even, cooperative, the specific tone of someone offering logistics, not a challenge. The windows are angled wrong for cover. If they come in from 3 directions. You've got one man at the door, one in the back, and you in the middle. Those are bad odds. Brody's eyes narrowed. I'm not suggesting anything, Jake said. I'm just pointing out a problem. So what? You're going to help me. Brody said, contempt, but also listening. I'm going to stay alive, Jake said. Same goal you have right now. Brody considered him. Then he stepped back and resumed his pacing. He looked at Tommy. He looked at the door. He looked at Marco, who was watching the front window with increasingly visible anxiety. his gun hand tensing and releasing in a cycle that was bad for everyone in the room. Then Brody walked back to the cashier and grabbed her hair again, hauling her head back so her throat stretched toward the ceiling, and pressed the barrel of the shotgun under her chin. "Tell them," he said to Tommy. "Tell them you saw something, but it was nothing. Tell them the alarm was a glitch. Tell them you're closing up, and everybody's fine." Tommy started to move toward the door. "That won't work either," said a new voice. Quiet. Unhurried. Flat in the way a horizon is flat. Not empty, just extending further than you can see. Brody's grip on the cashier's hair tightened. It was the cashier who had spoken. She had raised her head. Not dramatically, not with effort, just with the specific, measured deliberateness of someone who has decided that a thing needs doing and is doing it. Her eyes, for the first time in 30 minutes, were not on the floor. They were on Brody's face. The expression she wore was not defiance, exactly. It was something harder and quieter than defiance. It was the face of a person for whom the current situation had been, for the past half hour, not a crisis but a calculation, and who had now arrived at a conclusion. "They've already got a number on the vehicle," she said. "If they ran it before they pulled in, and they did, that's procedure. They know this isn't a glitch. Sending one person to the door with a scripted denial raises the probability of a forced entry. What you want is a reason to delay. A negotiation." She paused. "What you want is to talk to them yourself." Brody stared at her. "I can tell you what to say," she said. "Word for word. How to buy 2, maybe 3 hours. Enough time to think through your exit." The store was very quiet. Danny and Marco were looking at the cashier with expressions that had, without their permission, shifted from contempt to something else. "Why would you do that?" Brody said. "Because if you panic," she said, "the first person you shoot is going to be the nearest person to you. And that's me. A beat. I'm not going to help you. I'm going to help myself." Brody's jaw worked. He released her hair slowly. He stepped back. Jake looked at the cashier. She lowered her gaze back to the floor. The mask resettled. But for 5 seconds, Jake had seen her face uncovered, and he'd seen what lived there, a cold, total, operational calm. Not courage. Courage implied that fear was being overcome. This was the absence of the kind of fear that required overcoming. This was someone whose relationship with danger was different. Practiced. Professional. He had seen that face before. On 14 men. Over 16 years. Never on anyone who looked like her. Maya, he thought. Not certain yet. Not enough. But close enough that his hands, flat on his knees, had gone very still. It was Danny who fired. Not intentionally. Probably. Marco had said something, and Danny had replied, and Marco had grabbed Danny's arm. Jake didn't see the exact trigger, and Danny's gun had discharged once into the refrigerator case behind Jake's left shoulder. The sound was a physical thing. It hammered the room. Bottles exploded. Liquid and glass hit the back of Jake's jacket. Sarah screamed. The couple dropped to the floor. Tommy made a sound like a word he'd forgotten the end of. Jake felt the burn before he identified it. A lateral strip of fire across his right deltoid. The specific wrongness of tissue interrupted in a context the body found deeply objectionable. He pressed his left hand over it. Looked at his palm. Red. "Not my fault. You idiot." Brody and Danny were screaming at each other. Marco bolted. Not toward the door, just backward, away from the noise, away from the immediate disaster, pressing himself against the chip rack and disturbing an avalanche of Doritos that cascaded to the floor. His gun was pointed nowhere. Jake looked at the cashier. She was already rising. Not with urgency. Not with fear. Not with anything that had a name in the register of normal human responses to a crisis. She was rising the way something rises when it has been stopped by a hand that just let go, with the silent, inevitable completion of momentum that was already there, waiting, that had been there for 32 minutes. She came off her knees in a single movement that unfolded like a sentence. Continuous, grammatically perfect, already finished before it was fully begun. Her feet found the floor. Her spine straightened. Her hands, which had been resting on her knees in a posture of submission, came up and forward in a movement that converted their position directly into utility. She did not shout. She did not announce. She did not warn. She stopped pretending. Like turning off a light. Like closing a book. The trembling stopped. The downcast gaze resolved into a flat, clear, absolute focus. The woman who had been on her knees for 32 minutes was not in the room anymore. The woman who replaced her was someone else entirely. Jake, bleeding on the floor of a gas station in Nevada, stared at the cashier's face and placed it. Definitively. Completely. He knew this face. He knew it from 40 seconds of classified video, from a report he'd read under NDA conditions, from a personnel file that had been stamped reassigned in red letters and then locked behind a clearance he didn't have. Chun-Yi-Mei, he thought. Oh my God. It's Chun-Yi-Mei. He started to say something. He didn't get to finish it. Because the storm had already started. She moved toward Marco first. This was the correct choice for 3 reasons, and later, much later, over a drink in a bar that neither of them would be able to claim on any expense report, Jake would identify all 3 and Maya would simply shrug and say he was the easiest and the nearest, which was simultaneously underselling and precisely accurate. Marco was youngest, least experienced, and furthest from Brody. He was also holding his gun wrong. Right-hand dominant, but compensating with the left, a learned habit that suggested he'd picked up his shooting form from a video game or a movie rather than a range. His trigger discipline was non-existent. His attention was fragmented between Brody's explosion at Danny and the fierce smell of a situation that had gone sideways in a way he hadn't anticipated. What happened to Marco happened in approximately 1.8 seconds. Maya closed the distance with 2 steps that didn't announce themselves as steps. They were more like the room shortening. Her left hand caught Marco's gun arm at the wrist, not gripping but redirecting. The barrel went left, away from the hostages, away from anything important. Her right elbow found the inside of his elbow and applied a specific, targeted pressure that converted the joint into a lever. The gun left Marco's hand. Marco's wrist did not leave Marco's hand but expressed, in the universal language of fractures, a significant objection to recent events. Marco's mouth opened. The sound that came out was not a word. Maya's hand closed on the gun without looking at it. She was already looking at Danny. Danny had untangled himself from the argument with Brody and was turning. He was faster than Marco. He had more experience and less panic. He fired twice. The first shot passed through the space Maya had been occupying 0.4 seconds earlier. The second shot was closer. Jake, watching from the floor, felt the air move near his ear. Maya was no longer moving toward Danny. She had moved diagonally, not retreating, not advancing exactly, but relocating to an angle that made Danny's right-handed aim structurally inefficient. He would have to rotate his whole body to track her, and in the time it took to do that, she had covered the distance with a combination of strikes that Jake could follow in individual components but could not have identified in real time. Something to the throat that made Danny's next breath a decision rather than a reflex. Something to the inside of his knee that removed his vertical stability. Something, a takedown, technically correct to within decimal tolerances of the training manual. That put Danny on the tile floor on his back with Maya's knee on his sternum and the muzzle of Marco's confiscated gun pressed into the soft tissue under his jaw. Danny went still. 6 seconds had passed since she stood up. Then there was Brody. Brody Walsh was not Marco. He was not Danny. He was former Army. He'd washed out of Ranger selection, a fact that had lived in him for 9 years as a specific, festering injury to his sense of himself. And he had, in those 9 years, maintained the physical conditioning and the institutional knowledge of someone who had not entirely given up on the idea that he was what he'd been told he was. He had been in actual fights. He had managed actual violence. He was big, and he was trained. And for the first 6 seconds he'd been trying to locate the threat through the chaotic rearrangement of the room. When he found it, when he saw the size of what was crouching on Danny's sternum, which was to say, 120 pounds, female, 23 years old, blood drying on her cheekbone, something moved through his face. Not fear. The opposite. The dangerous reinflation of an ego that had felt briefly, impossibly threatened. "You've got to be kidding me," Brody Walsh said. He had the shotgun. He had 6 inches of height and 80 pounds of muscle. He had been in places worse than this. He advanced. He swung the shotgun at her head, a controlled, powerful arc, the kind designed to overwhelm rather than engage. She was not there. She'd vacated that position before the swing peaked, releasing Danny and moving under the barrel's trajectory so that the shotgun's motion carried it harmlessly through air. Her elbow found his ribs, 2 of them, specifically, and the sound that produced was a full stop of conversation. Brody grunted, pivoted, faster than expected. He caught her with a forearm strike that was genuine and well-aimed and landed on her shoulder with enough force to rock her sideways. She didn't stop. She used the sideways momentum, converted it, came back in from the new angle. The shotgun was the problem. Too long inside the store, the barrel kept hitting shelving. He couldn't find his range, and she kept making it the problem, staying inside his reach where the long weapon became an obstacle rather than an advantage. He dropped it and went to his sidearm, and she stopped him from drawing it. Not dramatically. He reached for the holster and her hand was already there, her thumb finding the retention snap, her body turning in a way that torqued his wrist into a geometry that his tendons loudly opposed. The gun came loose from the holster and wasn't in his hand. Brody threw a punch. It was a real punch, properly formed, with his shoulder behind it, the kind that ends conversations. She slipped it, inside, shoulder moving in a half-rotation that let the fist pass behind her. And something happened in the space where her hands were that Jake could not entirely track, but could identify by the aftermath. Brody Walsh's forward momentum continued without any corresponding braking, and then his knees found the floor, and then his face found the floor, and then Maya's knee was on the back of his neck and his own gun was braced in both her hands at the base of his skull. 29 seconds. 3 armed men. 29 seconds. 1 broken wrist, 2 subdued, 1 controlled. Sarah Mitchell was backed against the far wall with both hands over her mouth. Tommy had slid down the door to the bathroom hallway until he was sitting on the floor, knees to his chest, staring at the cashier with the particular, uncomprehending expression of a man watching something that should not be physically possible. Marco was cradling his wrist and crying quietly in the chip aisle. Danny was lying on his back, conscious, not moving. Brody Walsh's face was against the tile floor of a gas station in Harlow, Nevada, and he had begun, slowly, humiliatingly, involuntarily, to understand that the gun at the back of his neck was never going to be the surprising part of this story. The surprising part of this story was what she'd been before she picked it up. Maya Chun, cashier, inventory management, night shift, Ray's Stop Shop, stood up. She set Brody's gun on the counter. She reached under the register and produced 3 zip ties that she'd apparently kept there, and she used them to secure the 3 men's hands with the brisk efficiency of someone completing a task they'd done before. Then she looked at Jake. He was still on the floor, hand over the graze on his shoulder, staring at her. She looked at him for 1 full second. 2. Then she straightened, looked toward the ceiling, toward, Jake realized, the ventilation grate in the corner that served as a pinhole camera feed to the police monitoring station outside, and spoke in a voice that was completely, entirely, professionally calm. Building is clear. 3 subjects secured. 2 conscious, 1 semi-conscious. 1 gunshot wound, non-critical, in the back quadrant. I need medical at the east entrance. A beat. You can come in now. Her voice was the exact cadence of a tactical radio check-in. The exact cadence. Jake, bleeding quietly on the floor of a gas station convenience store, started to laugh. He couldn't identify when it started. It was just happening. Not hysterical, not relief exactly, just the specific, helpless laugh of a person who has been watching something impossible for 30 minutes and has now received confirmation that it was, indeed, impossible, and that the universe had gone ahead and let it happen anyway. He sat on the floor and bled and laughed while the doors opened and the officers came in, and Maya Chun stood at the register counter with her arms at her sides and blood on her face, and waited. They tried to detain her. Of course they did. Officer Greta Lund, first through the door, hand on her sidearm, already assessing the scene and making the entirely reasonable determination that the woman with blood on her face and a gun on the counter was a variable that required securing, said, "Ma'am, hands where I can see them, step away from the counter." Jake was on his feet before he decided to stand up. "Stand down," he said. Lund turned. She took in Jake, civilian clothes, hand pressed to his shoulder, blood soaking through his jacket, and arrived at the correct conclusion that he was a gunshot victim and the incorrect conclusion that he was therefore not a person whose instructions she needed to follow. "Sir, I need you to." "I'm Lieutenant Commander Jake Harmon, United States Navy," Jake said. Not loud, not aggressive. The specific register of a command that doesn't need to announce itself because it has never needed to. "I am instructing you, strongly, not to detain this woman. You can take my statement in 60 seconds. But do not put cuffs on her." Lund looked at him. looked at Maya, looked at the three men zip-tied on the floor of her jurisdiction. She took her hand off her sidearm. More officers were coming in. Paramedics. The noise of radio static and multiple voices, and the reoxygenation of a room that had been holding its breath for 41 minutes. Sarah Mitchell sank into a chair behind the counter and began crying with the profound, releasing quality of a person whose body had been waiting politely for permission. Tommy was telling someone his name and address approximately 4 times, unsolicited. Marco Vega, from the chip aisle, was explaining through tears that he'd never done anything like this before and that this had all been Brody's idea, establishing immediately and without being asked that he was the kind of person who volunteers information when frightened. Brody Walsh was not saying anything. He was being sat against the refrigerator case by 2 officers, and he was looking at the cashier with an expression that had traveled a very long way in 41 minutes, from contempt, through confidence, through confusion, through rage, through fear, and had arrived somewhere beyond all of those, somewhere that didn't have a common name but that Jake, who had put that look on men's faces in 3 different countries, recognized instantly as the expression of a person who is just discovered, with permanent and irreversible clarity, how badly they had miscalculated. Maya stood at the counter. She let the paramedic approach her and look at her cheek. She didn't look at Brody. Jake crossed the store and stood in front of her. She looked at him, directly, steadily, with the slightly remote quality of someone who has spent 14 months making their face unreadable and hasn't fully turned that off yet. Jake looked at her for a long time. "Chun," he said. Not a question. Something moved in her eyes, small, controlled. "Sir." "Chun Ime. Team 6. Operator 3rd class." He stopped. Re-examined something. Recalibrated. "You were listed as reassigned." "Yes, sir." "Classified reassignment." "Yes, sir." He looked around the store. At the zip-tied men. At the disassembled hostage situation. At the perfectly functional security camera feed that no one had bothered to explain should still be working. He looked at her. "The camera he shot," Jake said. "Dummy unit," she said. "The real feed is in the ventilation. Store's been a monitoring post for 8 months. Joint operation, DEA and Naval Intelligence. There's a distribution hub 3 miles east." A pause. Brody Walsh didn't pick this location randomly. He works for the organization we're building a case against. Or he did, until tonight. Jake absorbed this. So the robbery was probably not originally planned for tonight. My cover assessment is he got desperate. The organization he works for has been cutting loose ends, and he needed cash fast to run. She glanced at Brody. He just happened to walk into a store with a 15-meter tactical response time. Jake looked at her cheek. At the split, the swelling, the dark bruise forming around the impact site. "He hit you." "Yes." No inflection. Not minimizing, not performing. Just a statement of fact in the category of things that occurred. "You could have stopped it." She looked at him steadily. "I could have stopped it in a way that blew 14 months of operational groundwork and let 3 men and a distribution network walk. A beat. I took the hit." Jake was quiet for a long moment. "You took the hit," he said. He was establishing dominance. Letting him have that kept him from looking more carefully at the store. At the camera. At me. She paused. Tactical decision. Jake looked at the young woman in front of him, 23 years old, blood drying on her face, polo shirt 2 sizes too large, name tag reading MEI in white letters, and thought about every single moment in the last hour when he'd looked at her and seen a cashier. When Brody had looked at her and seen a target. When everyone in the room had looked at her and seen the weakest person present. He thought about 14 months. About a young operator with the highest technical scores in the program's history, who had walked into a nondescript convenience store in a forgotten Nevada town and put on the specific, practiced, daily costume of being overlooked. Not once. Not for a shift. For 14 months. "Did Reyes authorize?" he started. "Sir." She met his eyes. Not cutting him off, just drawing a clear line. "That's above this clearance level." He closed his mouth. Behind them, Brody Walsh said, to no one in particular, to the room, to the universe that had done this to him. "She's a cashier." His voice had the quality of a man discovering that the floor he's been standing on was never floor. The paramedic treating Maya's cheek glanced at him. Sarah Mitchell, from behind the counter, looked up from her crying with an expression of bleary, accumulating realization. Tommy Park, who had known the cashier as May, who had eaten lunch with her on the back steps 3 times a week for months, who had listened to her give customer service with a placid, measured patience that he'd privately admired and attributed to good temperament, looked at her now as though seeing through a particular lens for the first time, and the image resolving was nothing like what he'd thought he was looking at. She always knew the combination, Sarah said, in a tone of absolute, exhausted clarity. She always knew. Sarah stopped. Started again. I saw her open it once. Night when I forgot mine. She said she'd watched me do it enough times. Sarah looked at Maya. You always knew. Maya didn't deny it. There was a very long silence. Then Officer Greta Lund, who had been listening to all of this while a paramedic worked on Jake's shoulder and her partner secured the crime scene, and the whole evening revised itself around her like a document being significantly edited, said, in the voice of a person who has decided to simply accept what the facts are indicating. Is there anything in this building that is what it appears to be? Nobody answered, which was, Jake thought, probably the most honest answer available. 8:14 a.m. The parking lot of Ray's Stop Shop. The crime scene tape was up. The cruisers were still there. A forensics van had arrived sometime around 4, and was still there too, doing patient work to the interior of a store that had apparently been an active intelligence installation for 8 months, without anyone in Harlow, Nevada noticing, which said something about Harlow, Nevada. Jake sat on the hood of his rental car. His shoulder had been dressed, assessed as superficial, and dressed again. His coffee, a fresh one from a vending machine someone had retrieved for him, was approximately as bad as the one from last night, but he was drinking it anyway. He'd given his statement. All of it. The real version, the classified version, the version that required 3 separate federal-level phone calls before the night shift sheriff's deputy would put down his notebook. The version in which the cashier was not a cashier. At 8:14, the door to the store opened and Maya Chen came out. She was in street clothes now, a dark jacket, jeans, a bag over one shoulder that was compact and suggested it had been packed before tonight because it had been packed, in this regard, every night for 14 months. Her cheek was taped and swollen, the bruise spreading into the deep purples and yellows that meant it was going to be spectacular for about 2 weeks. She moved easily, without accommodation for the injury. A black SUV was parked at the far end of the lot. Jake recognized the model. He'd ridden in a few. Maya walked across the parking lot with the same unhurried, quiet, specific pace she'd carried through the store the night before, and Jake thought, I was watching her walk 12 hours ago, and I saw nothing. Which meant she had been perfect. Which meant she had always been perfect. Which meant 14 months of unremarkable shifts and inventory scans and customer service and early morning stocking runs had all been executed with a calibrated, total, daily invisibility that Jake found, as a man who had spent 17 years practicing a different kind of excellence, almost incomprehensibly difficult. Chun, he called. She stopped, turned. He slid off the hood of the car and walked to her. He stopped about 6 feet away, in the morning light, in the parking lot of a gas station convenience store. For what it's worth, he said, I almost didn't recognize you. She looked at him, the slight, controlled expression that might, in someone less practiced, have been a smile. I know, she said. That was the point, sir. A beat. You going to be all right? He said. He wasn't asking about the cheek. She looked at the black SUV. She looked at Jake. She looked at the store, at the crime scene tape, at the closed sign someone had hung on the door, at the dummy security camera above the entrance that Brody Walsh had destroyed with theatrical efficiency at 11:58 the previous night. I was all right the whole time, she said. Then she walked to the SUV and got in, and the SUV pulled out of the parking lot and turned south on Route 6 and reduced to a point, and then was nothing. Jake stood in the lot. Inside the store, he could see through the front window. Sarah Mitchell, in her manager's vest, was talking to Officer Lund with the specific, beleaguered, explanatory energy of someone who had been asked the same question several times. Through the glass, Jake couldn't hear the words, but he could read the shape of them. The repeated not sure, the I thought, I didn't know, she never said. He could see, on the counter next to Sarah, the name tag. May. White letters on a black background. Store logo in the corner. A 23-year-old woman had worn that for 14 months. Had answered to it. Had received complaints about the coffee temperature. Had been cheerful about the inventory count. Had been a reliable overnight shift and a pleasant enough presence, and a forgettable enough face that even the man who had once been responsible for her career advancement had walked into her store and not known her. Jake finished his coffee. It was very bad. He thought about the recommendation she'd made the first time they spoke. There's a 24-hour diner on Route 6 about 8 miles south, a lot better coffee. And he thought about how she'd offered that casually, helpfully, as a cashier would, and how the information had been completely accurate because of course it was. She'd been in this town for over a year. She knew everything about it. She knew everything about everything within her operational perimeter. She had known the safe combination and the camera angles and the attention cycles and the police response time. And she had taken a hit across the face and bled for a tactical outcome. And she had gotten back up, and she had. He got in his car. He drove 8 miles south on Route 6. The coffee at the diner was excellent. He sat in a booth by the window and drank it and thought, for a long time, about the things that are right in front of you that you never see. About the assumptions built into the shape of a polo shirt, a name tag, a ponytail at the end of a long shift. About the specific, weaponized utility of being underestimated. About a 23-year-old woman who had understood something about the world that most people spend their whole lives failing to grasp. That the most dangerous person in any room is the one everyone looked at and decided didn't matter. He left a 20 on the table. He drove to Vegas. Behind him, in the small town of Harlow, Nevada, the black SUV carrying May the cashier had already crossed the state line and was moving toward a briefing that would not be recorded in any document Jake Harmon was cleared to read, in pursuit of a mission that would not conclude in any report he would ever be shown, accomplished by a person whose name, the real one, would appear in no file currently accessible to him. She always knew the combination. She'd just been waiting for the right moment to use it.